To the news now, and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is going to Beijing as America looks to reset relations. But both sides will be hoping to overcome mutual mistrust. The top US diplomat will be traveling to Beijing in an attempt to rectify normal channels of communications after growing tensions between the two nations. Antony Blinken is the highest-ranking US government official to visit Beijing since President Joe Biden took office in January 2021. It comes as Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates is scheduled to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping, marking the president's first meeting with a foreign private entrepreneur in recent years. For more, we're joined now by Amy Hawkins, a senior China correspondent for The Guardian. Amy, welcome back to China Tonight.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Amy, Blinken's visit comes amid increasing tension between China and the US. So what's on the agenda?
So I think the first priority on Blinken's visit will be to limit the downward spiral of US relations. The two countries have been barely speaking for the past few months, so the main priority will just be to reopen the channels of communication so that they can discuss, like you say, China's position on Ukraine, and if China can be persuaded to, be more of a mediator in the Russia-Ukraine conflict rather than supporting Russia, tensions in the Taiwan Strait and China's military buildup in the South China Sea. And there are also areas of non-political dialogue that Blinken will be wanting to reopen channels of communication on, such as anti-narcotics, climate change, and the general global economy.
And what do China and the US hope to achieve with these meetings?
I think both sides want to be seen to be being open to dialogue. In reality, the measures that both sides have taken in terms of trade and export controls are still quite punitive. So, for example, the US has imposed export controls on advanced chip-making technology to China. China has banned companies from buying chips from Micron, an American company, in critical industries. And so there are still all these arenas where what is actually happening is that the two countries are making it harder and harder to have any kind of relationship. But I think both countries want to be seen to be trying to improve the relationship and reopen dialogue.
China's youth unemployment is at record highs. More than 11 million students are about to graduate, and jobs are becoming increasingly hard to find. Official data shows 1 in 5 aged between 16 and 24 are unemployed, about 4 times the broader unemployment rate in China. Amy, China is the world's second biggest economy. Why is there such a lack of work for its educated young people?
Part of the problem is during COVID, because there were basically no jobs and the economy was frozen, more people chose to stay in education for longer. So you have, even more highly educated young people coming out of the university system. We've got 11.6 million people who are graduating this month. But China's economic growth just hasn't picked up to the extent that it was expected after abandoned the zero COVID restrictions. So, on a number of indicators, the retail sales growth is lower than expected. Investment in property is lower than expected. And then there are certain industries such as education and technology, which the government has, done huge crackdowns on in recent years. And they were often big recruiters for educated young people. For example, the private tutoring industry, that was often a really popular job for young students as they entered the job market. That industry basically doesn't exist anymore. The government got rid of it overnight. So, while there are still probably jobs available in more like low-skilled jobs in rural areas, for young people who spent a lot of time and money on their education, they just feel like the jobs that they should be getting aren't available to them.
And how is China's government responding to this situation?
So the government is taking it really seriously. They said they want to create 12 million new urban jobs this year. But if you think about the numbers, that would be just enough to cover the graduating class for 2023. So it's not really enough. And they're also offering subsidies to state-owned enterprises for hiring young unemployed people. So they are encouraging companies to try and recruit more. But obviously, if the demand isn't there economically, where are companies going to find this money? And on the other hand, local governments are in huge levels of debt. So whereas previously, when the jobs market was slow, young people might look to civil service or government jobs as a more stable option. Now, local governments can't afford to hire lots of young people either. And so the other approach the government is taking is kind of to reprimand young people and tell them that they're being too picky and, they in state media, you see these stories about someone who went to a great university and is now a delivery driver or is teaching in a really rural area, and the government is trying to kind of promote these options as, more industrious, more noble pursuits than the white collar urban jobs that the young people were expecting.
Amy Hawkins, thank you so much for joining us on China Tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
And with youth unemployment at a record high, China's government is hoping to persuade them to move from the cities to the countryside and train as farmers.
The suggestion has drawn parallels to another time, more than half a century ago, when Chairman Mao Zedong sought to rid China's youth of their privileged city lives, including a teenaged Xi Jinping.
The biggest nation on earth, China, is in turmoil.
May 1966. Chairman Mao Zedong, whose authority has been weakened by China's Great Famine, seeks to reassert control over the Chinese Communist Party by weeding out enemies, real or imagined.
The great Supreme Commander, Chairman Mao, issued a world-shaking call to us. You should pay attention to state affairs and carry the great proletarian cultural revolution through to the end.
It was exciting. We thought he was a god.
The Little Red Book of Mao's quotes is made compulsory reading, and Chinese students spring into action, setting up Red Guard divisions in classrooms across the country. Their mission? Destroy capitalist influences and so-called bourgeois thinking.
Those kids who were the most revolutionary chanted Mao's quotation: "A revolution is not a dinner party. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence."
Mao shuts down schools and universities. Gangs of Red Guard teenagers roam the streets.
Teachers were the target of the political campaign.
Red Guards also target intellectuals and representatives of capitalism, like landlords. Mao urges them to destroy the four olds: old ideas, old customs, old habits, and old culture.
Old sculptures from the Tang, Sung, and Ming dynasties were piled in a heap. The rebels were full of themselves.
And millions of students are sent to the countryside to be re-educated by peasants through hard labor, including teenager Xi Jinping. The Cultural Revolution finally ends in September 1976, when Mao dies at the age of 82. Historians estimate the turmoil left up to 2 million people dead, alongside widespread abuse, public humiliation, and torture. And the men who unleashed the reign of terror remains the most enduring political brand in China. Mao's face is on banknotes and t-shirts, and his portrait hangs over the entrance to the Forbidden City in Beijing. But another face is now appearing beside Mao's, that of current President Xi Jinping. And just like Mao, Xi is targeting China's youth.
Tanya Brannigan was The Guardian's China correspondent from 2008 to 2015, and she's the author of Red Memory: Living, Remembering and Forgetting China's Cultural Revolution. Tanya, welcome to China Tonight.
Hello.
Tanya, with mass youth unemployment hitting China's urban areas and Xi Jinping suggesting the young should head to the countryside, this is sounding like what happened during the Cultural Revolution, isn't it?
So it was such a sort of unimaginably turbulent time. And of course, it was justified by Mao's ideology, which was that these educated youth would help to sort of pull the countryside into modernity. And at the same time, that the peasants would really teach the educated youth how to be proper communists and how to be purer and better as people and serve the people better. But underlying it was a very pragmatic basis, which was that they were really frustrated at the top and tired. Even Mao was concerned by the sort of the chaos that the Red Guards had engendered, and there was a feeling that that had to be got under control. There were too many young people in the cities. There weren't enough jobs for them. You can see the parallels. And so it was a very pragmatic move, really, to send them to the countryside. And so one of the very first things that Xi Jinping did when he took power was to go down to the National Museum of China with his colleagues and show them this exhibition, which is all about how the Communist Party saved China from all the years of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers and has led it back to greatness. And this has been a hugely important narrative. It's dependent more and more upon that story. It can't afford for that to be questioned. It can't allow people to sort of think too deeply, of course, about what the party has done.
Tanya, you say it's impossible to understand China today without understanding the Cultural Revolution. Why is that?
Because it's really shaped and scarred, I think, China, both in terms of the population as a whole and in terms of its political leadership as well. So if you look at a figure like Xi Jinping, obviously, he is somebody whose entire family suffered in the Cultural Revolution. His father had already sort of fallen from favor, but suffered much more when the Cultural Revolution began. His elder sister, we believe, killed herself after years of political struggle. Xi himself was denounced at struggle sessions. We're told his mother had to denounce him at one point, and then he was sent off to the countryside and spent years struggling there. So it's something that certainly shaped the people who are alive now and who are determining the future of China. It's shaped society in so many ways. I think the lack of trust that many people feel in others, the fractured relationships that you often see within families, the trauma people are still experiencing and living with now. People who might not initially sort of think of it as a mental problem, and yet their children or grandchildren can clearly see these difficulties they have that are still tied to the Cultural Revolution, even though, or perhaps especially because they can't talk about it. Although it was obviously unleashed by Mao, one of the most powerful things, I think, is the fact that everybody was caught up with it. It was really impossible not to participate in some way. And so I think from outside, people often think about victims and perpetrators, but in fact, many people who lived through the era were both victims and perpetrators because the situation just simply kept changing.
We know Xi Jinping was a victim of the Cultural Revolution, yet he seems to go back to that time for political wisdom, tapping into Mao's legacy. How do you make sense of the apparent parallels between Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because his father and other party elders obviously spent so long trying to build up these safeguards, sort of a more collectivized style of rule, prevent any strongman from ever taking charge again. And Xi has obviously sort of destroyed really all of that. He's there indefinitely now. Term limits have been done away with. So it is very striking, I think, that in some ways, he seems to have drawn so strongly on Mao's playbook that he has this ability or this concern about speaking to the people. He has this sense of how to sort of tap into that collective spirit that, as you say, there's a sort of personality cult, not on the level of Mao, clearly, but very much emerging with Xi Jinping thought being sort of taught even in schools to very young children. That we are seeing all of this develop, but there are sort of profound differences as well. Mao sort of famously said he was both tiger and monkey, but the tiger spirit was supreme. In other words, the forceful, the controlling, the emperor-like part of him. It's really impossible to imagine Xi ever comparing himself to a monkey at all, because Mao also had the very disruptive side to him that loved chaos and disorder. And it's very clear that for Xi, discipline and order is really central. He hasn't destroyed party institutions in the way that Mao has. He's sort of taken control of them and reinforced them in many ways. So the differences are perhaps as striking, but what's intriguing is that clearly so many people within China have seen the parallels, whether that be the very daring scholar who sort of penned a piece about the new personality cult that was sort of being held up and how could this happen all the years after the Cultural Revolution, through to the ordinary people who we saw out on the streets in those zero COVID protests, holding up signs saying reform, not the Cultural Revolution. And so clearly people do see a resonance and they do see the parallels there.
Tana Brannigan, thank you so much for joining us on China Tonight.
Thank you.
The Cultural Revolution seems so far away from our generation, but we all know someone in our family who's impacted by it.
Yeah, in a way, it's not that far away from our generation at all. My mum talks about the Great Leap Forward and how my family was affected by that, especially my aunt. She's a very small lady, and we talk about how she was malnourished during that time. And my grandma saw lots of people who had died as a result, and she had to go into the forest to hide. And what happened was they still see it as a positive because Mao Zedong was able to bring them out of that and provide them with the resources to create the China that we have today. So that's my mum's perspective. My dad grew up in Hong Kong during that time though, so he was less affected by it. So he was a bit more critical of some of the policies, but also saw some benefits. For instance, having a more secular society, that was something that he supported. So in my family, there's a lot of different views. What about you?
Well, it's fascinating to see, it's a traumatic time, but a lot of Chinese people are nostalgic about Maoism, nostalgic about the Cultural Revolution. I have a family member who would go to this annual gathering of educated youth who used to be sent to the countryside from the cities. So it's interesting to see how the Cultural Revolution is reflected in modern China.
To what's trending, and marriages in China have reached an all-time low at the same time as a birth rate crisis. Beijing is trying to ramp up efforts to encourage people to have children. It's in the wake of China's fertility rate hitting a record of 6.77 per 1,000 births last year. In 2016, China abandoned its decades-old one-child policy and is now encouraging women to have up to 3 babies.
Studies show that the more experts discuss birth rates, the more women would choose to remain childless throughout their lives.
Yeah, it's no surprise that mentioning statistics like 6.77 per 1,000 births is killing everybody's lady boners.
What this expert is saying is that the reason young people are reluctant to have children isn't because they can't afford it, but that they are selfish.
High housing prices are the best contraceptive pills. Healthcare is the best IUD, and education is the best condom.
And as we all know, what's safer than using one condom? 2 condoms, of course! So get that double degree, ladies, and stay protected from unwanted government policies intruding on your sex life. Strong winds in China's Hubei province blew away restaurant staff as they tried to hold down a canopy. Several men were sent flying as they tried to anchor down the roof during a major storm. As we've established time and time again, this is why women live longer.
This suggests that sometimes it's necessary to let go when the time comes. Those who persist until the end may end up experiencing the most pain.
Humans are no match to nature.
After all, the boss really stepped up. The business must thrive later.
Anyway, the biggest scene stealer is this guy. He full Mary Poppins'd his way out of there. Where did he go? I'm pretty sure he lives in the moon now. The good news is there were no fatalities, and the people featured in that video went on to form a new troupe called Cirque du Hubei. And finally, to a student finding a rat's head inside his school meal. He received a staggering 310 million views on Weibo. Local authorities claim it was part of a duck's neck, a common ingredient in soups, but the viral video spawned a menu of duck rat memes and spoofs. Oh, sorry. Did you order number 47 duck neck rat head or the 74 rat neck duck head, which also happens to be different to the duck head cooked by our head rat? Ugh, who am I to yuck someone else's yum? Anyway, that's it for this week's trending headlines.
Go anywhere in the world and the chances are you will stumble across a Chinese restaurant.
But in India, the influence of Chinese migrants has led to an interesting fusion, and it's the ultimate option for the indecisive. Sam and reporter Tejas Bhatt explain why we can't get enough of Chindian cuisine.
Oh, hey Tej.
Hey Sam.
What'd you get?
I just got Indian, same old, What about you?
I just got Chinese.
Well, that's not stereotypical of us at all.
I know. This is boring. Hey, you know what? Why don't we combine our foods?
Great idea.
What the f, Tej? Why did you just do that? Leave it to the professionals.
You mean like Chindian?
What's Chindian?
Sam, this is legit. It's called Indian Chinese cuisine or Indo-Chinese cuisine. It's very, very popular in India. Trust me, it's legit.
So I decided to fly down to Melbourne to try it out.
While I'm meeting a foodie in Parramatta in Sydney. Wait, how come you get to fly?
Well, Melbourne is the food capital of Australia, according to Melburnians. Steve Liu is the chef and the owner of the Great Eastern Hakka restaurant. He's a second-generation Chinese Indian born in Calcutta, India's capital under British Raj, and home to Chindian cuisine. Now he's cooking up his favorite dish for me.
This is a Manchurian chicken, very famous among the Indian people and the Indian style Chinese cooking. We cook this dish with quite amount of garlic and ginger with a touch of vinegar.
It's succulent, tender, and saucy, with a touch of sweet and sour flavors. And the origin of this iconic dish has recently caused quite a stir on the internet, as many netizens were outraged by a New York Times article initially describing it as Pakistani Chinese cooking before changing it to Desi Chinese.
When did Manchurian become Pakistani Chinese?
This is real cultural appropriation.
These days, almost every Indian menu has Chinese-style dishes, including Sheikh Rahmani's restaurant.
This is Szechuan fried rice, basmati rice, tossed up in a wok, and you have soy sauce, chili, garlic, the Indian ingredients, and served with tomato sauce. If you go to a typical Indian Chinese restaurant, they usually call it the Great Wall Cuisine, which has a myriad of Chinese Sichuan-based cuisines, like the wontons and the dumplings. We have sort of bastardized, if I may use, the Chinese into South Indian cuisine.
I'm picking up on the spices that you'd normally find in Indian foods, right?
It's an explosion of
exactly.
India and China happening in your taste buds.
Chindian food is taking over India, from chili chicken to Hakka chow mein and gobi Manchurian.
Indian people love the coriander, love the chili, and love the garlic, and love the ginger, and just touch of the vinegar. You cannot go wrong.
Chindian is a blanket term which is covering almost everything which anybody in India or the Indian subcontinent would probably identify as of Chinese origin or predominantly Chinese flavor. Noodles, dumplings, dim sums, suimei, spring rolls, anywhere from a street side to a deluxe hotel, it is immensely popular. Some people would even argue that people, when they eat out of the house, eat Chindian more than they eat any other cuisine. And the reason for that, I think, is very simple. Chindian food combines two essential elements of familiar and the exotic.
Shekhar also grew up in Chinatown in Calcutta, where he was exposed to both Indian and Chinese cuisines from a young age.
A lot of Indians who have absolutely no clue of its origins think, oh, I want to have Chinese. They don't say Indian Chinese. You know what they say when in Calcutta in circles, social circles, I'm going to have Chinese today. You know, everyone says, no, I'll have Chinese too. So it doesn't mean that they're talking about Indo-Chinese. They think this is the authentic Chinese food that they're getting.
And that's because the Chinese migrants and Chinese food have been around in India for centuries.
In the 70s, we have about 4 Chinese restaurants in the Chinatown area, only 4. And now, 40 years later, the same area have 120 restaurants. Indian people, they like more flavor in the food. So you can add chili powder, you can add garam masala, you can add a lot of different spices. Look very much like Chinese food noodle, but once you put it in your mouth, it's become curry flavor. So I don't know if it's the right way or the wrong way, but I grew up with this. At the end of the day, it's still Indian Chinese.
For Steve, Chindian cuisine is more than just food.
Every time I eat this, just remind me back home, when I was kids, when my grandma and my mom used to cook for us. So bring a lot of love.
The Chinese cuisine is constantly evolving because you see, it's no more Chinese. It has a Chinese slant to it. That's exactly how it has evolved. And there's always going to be some element of Chinese in that whole cuisine concept.
Hey Tej.
Oh, hey Sam, how are you?
Good, how was Parramatta?
Pretty amazing. How was Melbourne?
Amazing. I even bought you back some food.
No way, I got you something as well.
Well, that package just makes me hungry again. I love this fusion cuisine because it's a mix of different cultures where China meets India. So have you ever cooked Chindian?
I don't know if it counts, but recently I was cooking Indian and I ran out of papadums, so I decided to substitute with prawn crackers and it worked really well. And I don't know if people watching at home, if I've ever served you prawn crackers, I don't know if you know this, but I've been using the same packet from 15 years ago and they're still good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Never thought of that.
Also, hot tip, you can put curry powder in absolutely anything. I've had curry powder in noodles, in potatoes, so even if it's Asian, it can taste really good if you just add that little bit of Indian flavour to it. It's not very advanced, but I highly recommend it. It's one of the biggest events on China's lunar calendar, the annual Dragon Boat Festival.
The tradition dates back more than 2,000 years in honor of ancient Chinese poet Qu Yuan. Legend has it that Qu Yuan threw himself into the Milo River after the Qing army invaded his motherland in 278 BC.
Fishermen raced out in their boats to try and save him, while others dropped zongzi, or sticky rice dumplings, into the river, hoping the fish would eat the rice rather than his body.
And now it's tradition to eat zongzi and enjoy dragon boat races during the festival, which kicks off next week. And I actually tried to make some zongzi, a sticky task as it turns out.
好的 ，Lucy， 我们今天要做什么呢？
今天我们要包粽子，那这边呢全部都是包粽子的食材。
能给我们介绍一下吗？今天那么多的食材。
是的，这边的话是包八宝粽，你看有花生、红枣、桂圆、莲子、红豆、绿豆、紫米，还有我们的糯米，这个一共是8宝。然后这边呢就是包咸粽子的食材了，这有腌好的五花肉。 然后这是麻辣小龙虾，然后这个是我们今天早上刚从海鲜市场捞来的野生黑边鲍鱼。
好呀，那我们今天包哪一种粽子呢？
我们今天就包一个我们特色的这个鲍鱼粽，鲍鱼小龙虾粽。这个是新鲜的竹叶，你看它是很绿的，上面还有一些水。
是要两片吗？
对，要2片，你挑大的比较好包。
好啊。对，
然后这2个叶子呢，你这样对折，对，然后呢，这样。 在1/3处，哎，这样一卷。我可是学了好多年。
哇，这个太难包了。
端午节对我来说就是充满了这个儿时的回忆。小的时候最喜欢的就是看着爷爷奶奶他们包粽子，然后他们也教过我很多次，我都学不会。接下来我们就可以拿去煮了。
好吧，那我们去煮吧。很好吃哎。然后我觉得这个肉，里边的这个肉质也非常的鲜美。
喜欢吃就好。喜欢吃这些都给你吃。
好啊，那我都带回家了，谢谢。